Victoria, born May 24th, 1819. At the time, there was little reason to believe she would one day become one of the most famous monarchs in history. In fact, when Victoria was born, she was not expected to inherit the throne at all. The British royal family appeared secure, as King George III had many sons. Logic suggested that one of these sons would produce heirs who would continue the royal line. But history rarely follows the most obvious path. Victoria's father was Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of George III. Her mother, Princess Victoria, a German princess from one of Europe's many royal families. Just 8 months after Victoria was born, her father died. She would grow up with no memory of him. The loss had both emotional and practical consequences. Without her father, Victoria's household depended heavily on her mother and the advisors who surrounded her. Among these advisors, none would become more influential or more controversial than John Conroy. As Victoria grew older, events within the royal family gradually changed her position in the line of succession. Several potential heirs died, others failed to produce legitimate children. One by one, the people standing between Victoria and the throne disappeared. What had once seemed unlikely slowly became possible, then probable, then almost certain. Yet, while Victoria's future importance was increasing, her personal freedom was shrinking. Her childhood was dominated by a strict system of rules. Officially, it existed to protect the young princess. Unofficially, many historians believe it also served another purpose: control. Victoria was rarely allowed to be alone. She was supervised almost constantly. She slept in the same room as her mother. She was not permitted to walk downstairs without someone accompanying her. Her friendships were carefully monitored, her social life was restricted. Even ordinary activities often required approval. The result was an unusual childhood. Victoria lived inside palaces, she met important people, she enjoyed privileges unavailable to ordinary citizens. Yet she often felt trapped. Years later, she would describe parts of her childhood with clear resentment. She disliked the constant supervision, she distrusted John, and she became determined never to allow herself to be controlled. That determination would become one of the defining characteristics of her reign. The more others attempted to influence her decisions, the more stubborn she became. Despite these restrictions, Victoria received a strong education. She studied history, learnt geography, and developed fluency in several languages. She practiced drawing, studied music, and perhaps most importantly, she developed the habit of keeping detailed journals. These journals became a lifelong practice. They provide historians with one of the most complete personal records left by any monarch in modern history. Through them, we can see Victoria not simply as a queen, but as a person, curious, emotional, strong-willed, and highly observant. Even as a teenager, she understood that her future might be extraordinary. There is a famous story from her youth. One day, while studying a family tree, she finally understood how close she stood to the throne. After looking at the chart, she reportedly became quiet. Then she said, "I will be good." Whether those exact words were spoken is impossible to know, but the story survived because it captures something important. Victoria understood that responsibility might one day fall upon her, and she wanted to be worthy of it. As she entered her late teenage years, tensions inside the household increased. John Conroy appeared increasingly confident that Victoria would soon become queen. There were even suggestions that he hoped to remain close to power once she inherited the throne. Victoria had no intention of allowing that to happen. She resisted his influence whenever possible. She rejected attempts to make herself dependent upon him, and she waited. Then, in June 1837, everything changed. King William IV died. Victoria was 18 years old. In the early morning hours, senior officials arrived. The young princess was awakened. She was informed that the king was dead and that she was now queen. The moment has become one of the most famous scenes in British history. An 18-year-old woman, raised under constant supervision, suddenly found herself responsible for one of the most powerful nations on earth. Victoria later described the moment with seriousness rather than excitement. She understood immediately that her life had changed forever. One of her first decisions as queen was surprisingly simple. She requested a room of her own. For most people, that would not seem significant, but for Victoria, it represented independence. For the first time in her life, she would not live under constant parental supervision. For the first time, she would govern herself. It was a small act, but it symbolized something much larger. The child was gone, and the queen had arrived. Yet becoming queen did not automatically make her an experienced ruler. Britain was not an absolute monarchy. Real power was shared between the crown, parliament, and government ministers. Victoria would need to learn how this system worked. Fortunately, she found a mentor, Prime Minister Lord Melbourne. Melbourne became one of the most important figures in the early years of her reign. He explained government, introduced her to political realities, and taught her how a constitutional monarchy functioned. Victoria admired him greatly. Some critics worried that she relied too heavily upon his advice, but there is little doubt that Melbourne helped transform a young and inexperienced monarch into a capable constitutional ruler. The lessons were not always easy. One of the first major challenges became known as the bedchamber crisis. The dispute centered on members of Victoria's household and revealed how closely politics and monarchy could become connected. The details were complicated, but the lesson was simple. Being queen did not mean always getting what you wanted. It meant balancing personal feelings with constitutional responsibility. Victoria was learning that ruling involved compromise, practice, and restraint. These lessons would shape the rest of her reign. By the end of her first years on the throne, several important characteristics had already become clear. She was intelligent, determined, possessed a strong sense of duty, and she refused to allow others to make decisions for her. The isolated girl had become queen, but the most important relationship of her life had not yet begun. Soon, a young German prince would enter the story. His name was Albert, and together they would help define an age. By the time Victoria had settled into her role as queen, her life had become stable in one sense, but uncertain in another. She had power, authority, and responsibility, but she did not yet have a partner. And for a young monarch, that question was not personal alone. It was political, because whoever Victoria chose to marry would not simply become her husband. He would become part of the structure of the British monarchy itself. Among the European royal families of the time, connections were tightly linked. Kings, queens, and princes were often related through marriage across multiple countries. Within this network stood a young German prince. His name was Albert of Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha. Albert was Victoria's first cousin. They had met briefly in earlier years, but at the time it meant very little. Now, everything had changed. In 1839, Albert visited England again. Victoria was now queen, and this meeting carried a different weight. Albert was not powerful in a political sense. He ruled no country. He commanded no army. But what he did have was education, discipline, and a serious approach to life. He studied philosophy, science, history, and political systems. He was thoughtful, careful, and deeply interested in reform and progress. Victoria was immediately impressed. In her private journals, she described him with clear admiration, not just for his appearance, but for his character. For Victoria, this was important, because she was not just choosing a husband, she was choosing someone who would live inside the center of power. And perhaps for the first time in her life, she was making a personal decision that felt entirely her own. However, there was constitutional complications. As queen, Victoria could not formally be proposed to. The normal rules did not apply to her. Instead, she had to be the one to take the initiative. And so, in October 1831, Victoria made a decision that surprised many people. She proposed marriage to Albert herself, in which he accepted, and their engagement was announced shortly after. Reactions across Britain were mixed. Some welcomed the match, others were uncertain about Albert's foreign background, and many questioned what role a husband would have in the system where the wife was the sovereign. These questions would follow them for years. Victoria and Albert were married on February 10th, 1840. The ceremony took place at St. James's Palace in London. Crowds gathered in large numbers, public interest was high. The young queen appeared genuinely happy. For many people, the marriage symbolized stability after years of political change. But the reality of their life together would be more complex. Albert entered a position that had no clear definition. He was not king, he had no official political authority, but he was also not an ordinary citizen. He lived at the center of power, close to decisions and influence, but not formally part of the system that made those decisions. At first, this created frustration. Albert was intelligent and ambitious. He wanted to contribute, he wanted to be useful, but there was no established role for him to occupy. Over time, however, his position began to evolve. Victoria trusted him deeply. She valued his judgment. She relied on his advice. Gradually, Albert became involved in matters of state, administration, and royal organization. He reviewed documents, he advised on policy discussions, he helped manage the royal household more efficiently, and he brought a structured, disciplined approach to the monarchy. Some historians argue that Albert became one of the most important influences on Victoria's thinking. Others see him more as a stabilizing partner, but in either interpretation, his impact was significant. Their relationship also changed the public image of the monarchy itself. Before Victoria and Albert, the monarchy was often seen as distant and formal. After them, a different image emerged. A royal family centered not only on power but on domestic life, marriage, children, home, and stability. This image became extremely important in Victorian Britain, especially as society itself was changing rapidly. Victoria and Albert eventually had 9 children. These children would go on to marry into many of Europe's royal families, creating a wide network of dynastic connections across the continent. Public life and private life began to merge in the image of the monarchy. Paintings, portraits, and public appearances often showed the royal family in domestic settings. This was not accidental. It helped strengthen the monarchy's place in a rapidly changing society. But life was not without danger. Victoria survived several assassination attempts during her reign. Some occurred while she was travelling in public. Shots were fired at her carriage, threats were made, but she continued appearing in public life. And in many cases, public sympathy for her increased rather than decreased. At the same time, Albert pursued projects that reflected his interests in science, education, and progress. He believed strongly in modernization. He supported expeditions, institutions, and reforms that encouraged learning and industry. This vision would reach its most important expression in 1851, the Great Exhibition. Held in London, the expedition brought together achievements from across the industrial world. Machines, inventions, scientific tools, manufactured goods, and cultural artifacts, all displayed in one place. At the center of it stood the Crystal Palace, a vast structure made of iron and glass. It was a symbol of industrial progress, of modern engineering, and of Britain's growing global influence. Victoria and Albert attended together. The event was a public success. It strengthened Britain's international reputation, and it reinforced Albert's belief that progress could be achieved through knowledge, industry, and cooperation. By this point, their partnership had become central not only to their personal lives, but to the image of the monarchy itself. Victoria represented authority, Albert represented progress. Together, they represented stability in a rapidly changing world. And in doing so, they helped define what the Victorian Age would become. By the middle of Victoria's reign, Britain was no longer the same country she had become queen of. The world outside the palace was changing faster than any monarch could fully control. And in many ways, it was not Victoria shaping the age, it was the age shaping itself. This period is often called the Victorian Age. It is important to understand what that really means. It does not simply refer to Queen Victoria. It refers to a full transformation of society, industry, technology, and daily life. At the center of this transformation was the Industrial Revolution. By the 19th century, it was no longer a new development. It was fully active, and it was reshaping everything. Steam power replaced traditional manual labor in many industries. Factories grew larger and more efficient. Coal mining expanded to fuel machines and trains. Iron production increased to support construction and engineering. The landscape of Britain itself began to change. Small towns expanded into industrial cities, new urban centres emerged almost overnight. Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, London grew rapidly, becoming one of the largest cities in the world. But this growth came with a cost. Industrial cities were often overcrowded. Housing was built quickly and without long-term planning. Sanitation systems were poor in many areas. Disease spread easily. For many workers, life was difficult. Long working hours, low wages, unsafe conditions. Child labour was common in factories and mines. At the same time, a new middle class was growing. Institutionalists, business owners, professionals, clerks, teachers. This group began to shape politics, culture, and values. They placed importance on stability, respectability, education, and family life. Technology also transformed communication. The telegraph allowed messages to travel long distances in minutes rather than days. Newspapers expanded rapidly, information spread faster than ever before. Literacy rates increased as public education developed. The world was becoming more connected internally. Scientific thinking also advanced during this period. One of the most significant figures was Charles Darwin. His ideas about evolution challenged traditional understandings of life and creation. These ideas were wildly debated, sometimes accepted, sometimes rejected. But they changed scientific thought permanently. Medicine also began to improve. Hospitals became more organized. Public health reforms started to address disease and sanitation. Sewage systems were introduced in major cities. These changes helped reduce some of the worst outbreaks of disease. But the transformation of society was not equal. Wealth and poverty existed side by side. In many industrial cities, luxury and extreme hardship were separated only by short distances. While some lived in large homes with servants, others lived in overcrowded slums. These contrasts became one of the defining features of Victorian Britain. Social reform movements began to respond to these inequalities. Campaigns for workers' rights grew stronger. Trade unions began to form and gain influence. Political reform expanded voting rights over time, although slowly and unevenly. The structure of society was shifting. Religion also played a major role in Victorian life. Church attendance remained important for many people, but new scientific ideas created tension between traditional beliefs and modern thought. The Victorian period became a time of both faith and doubt. Cultural values became strongly defined during this time. Ideas about morality, discipline, and respectability became central to public life. Family structure was emphasized, public behavior was closely judged. At the same time, Britain expanded its global influence. The British Empire continued to grow across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and beyond. Trade networks expanded, colonial administration increased, Britain became the center of a global system of commerce and communication. Railways and steamships connected distant regions more efficiently than ever before. The world was becoming smaller in terms of distance, but larger in terms of connection. Through all of this, Queen Victoria remained a symbolic figure. She was not directly involved in every political or industrial decision, but she represented continuity, stability, and national identity during a time of rapid change. Her role was not to control every transformation. Her role was to exist as a constant presence while everything else evolved. By the end of this period, Britain was no longer simply a European kingdom. It had become the center of a global empire. By the later years of Victoria's reign, Britain was no longer just a major world power. It had become the center of a global empire, a system that stretched across continents, across oceans, and across very different cultures and societies. This expansion did not begin in Victoria's reign, but it reached its greatest scale during it. The British Empire grew through trade, exploration, military power, and political control. It included territories in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. At the center of this system was India. India was not just another colony, it was the most important part of the empire, economically, politically, and symbolically. In 1857, a major uprising occurred in India against British rule. This event is often referred to as the Indian Rebellion of 1857. It began within sections of the British-controlled military forces in India, known as sepoys. But it quickly spread into a wider rebellion across several regions. The causes were complex. They included political control, economic pressure, cultural tensions, and resentment towards foreign administration. The rebellion was eventually suppressed by British forces, but it changed the structure of British rule in India permanently. After the uprising, the British government dissolved the East India Company, and control of India was transferred directly to the British Crown. This marked a major shift. India was now governed not by a private company but by the state itself. And in 1876, Queen Victoria was given a new title, Empress of India. This title was not just symbolic, it reflected the reality of Britain's imperial structure. Victoria was now the formal head of an empire that governed a large portion of the world's population. At the same time, the empire was held together by complex systems. Trade routes connected colonies to Britain, raw materials flowed into industrial centers, manufactured goods were sent back across the world, steamships made long-distance travel faster, railways expanded across colonies, and new communication systems, including telegraph cables, allowed messages to travel across continents in hours instead of months. This created a global network of connection that had never existed before. But the empire was not only about economics. It was also about politics and influence. British administrators governed colonies with different levels of local participation. In some regions, traditional rulers remained in place under British oversight. In others, direct control was established. This created a patchwork system of governance across the empire. During this time, Queen Victoria also became known across Europe through her family connections. Her children and grandchildren married into royal families across the continent. Germany, Russia, Greece, Romania, Norway, and other European states. This created a dense network of dynastic relationships, so widespread that Victoria became known as the grandmother of Europe. These connections were political as well as personal. They linked European royal houses together at a time when nationalism and rivalry were increasing. However, these family ties did not present future conflict between European powers. They only showed how interconnected European leaders had become. As Victoria grew older, she also developed a relationship with India that became more personal in its symbolism. In her later years, she formed a close association with Abdul Karim, known as her Indian attendant. He taught her aspects of Indian culture and language. This relationship was controversial within the royal household. It reflected both the distance and the connection between ruler and empire. By this stage of her reign, Victoria herself was less involved in direct governance, but her image remained central to the identity of the empire. She represented continuity, authority, and stability, even as the world around her had become more complex. The empire at its height was powerful, but was also difficult to manage. Distance created challenges. Communication still took time, even with the new technology. Different regions had different needs and pressures, and maintaining control over such a large system required constant administration. But from Britain's perspective at the time, the empire represented strength, global reach, and influence on an unprecedented scale. It was often described as an empire on which the sun never set, because at any moment, somewhere within it, the sun was always shining. By the end of Victoria's reign, the British Empire covered roughly a quarter of the world's land surface, and a significant portion of its population. But beneath this scale, tensions already existed. National movements were beginning to form in several colonies. Demands for independence would grow in the decades after Victoria's death. But during her lifetime, the empire still appeared stable, large, organized, and enduring. Victoria remained its symbolic head until the end. As Queen Victoria entered the final decades of her life, the world around her continued to change.
But her own life was marked by a very different kind of transformation. Not expansion, not progress, but loss. In 1861, Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, became seriously ill. His condition worsened quickly. Despite medical attention, there was little that could be done. Albert died on December 14th, 1861, at the age of 42. Victoria was devastated. His death marked a turning point in her life. From that moment onward, she withdrew from public appearances. She entered a long period of mourning. She wore black clothing for the rest of her life and avoided large public events when possible, as well as reducing her direct visibility as monarch. Many people in Britain began to question her absence. Some criticized her for stepping back from public life. Others sympathized deeply with her grief. Over time, her withdrawal created political tension. There was even discussions about the role of the monarchy itself. But Victoria did not leave her position. She remained queen, even if she was no longer publicly present as before. Gradually, over the years, she began to return to public life in a limited way. New political leaders emerged during this period. Among them was Benjamin Disraeli, who developed a strong relationship with Victoria. He understood the importance of royal symbolism, and he helped her restore her public image. Victoria had a complicated relationship with William Ewart Gladstone. Their political views often differed, but both played major roles during her later reign. Despite earlier withdrawal, Victoria's authority as a symbol of the nation remained strong. In 1876, she adopted a new imperial title, Empress of India. This reinforced her role as a symbolic head of a global empire. In 1887, Britain celebrated her Golden Jubilee, 50 years on the throne. Public celebrations marked her long reign. In 1897, the Diamond Jubilee followed, 60 years as queen. By this point, Victoria had become more than a political figure. She became a national symbol, a representation of continuity in a rapidly changing world. Britain itself had transformed dramatically during her lifetime, from a kingdom still adjusting after the Napoleonic era to the center of a global industrial and imperial system. As Victoria aged, she became one of the longest reigning monarchs in Britain history. Her presence connected different generations. Many of her subjects had never known another monarch. In her final years, she became increasingly frail. Her health declined gradually. She continued to perform official duties where possible, but her energy was limited. Surrounded by family and attendants, she spent her final days at Osborne House on the Isles of Wight. Queen Victoria died on January 22nd, 1901. She was 81 years old. Her son, Edward VII, succeeded her. With her death, the Victorian Age officially came to an end. But the world she had lived through did not simply disappear. It remained in the institutions she influenced, in the global systems that had been built during her reign, and in the cultural memory that continued long after her death. Her legacy is complex. On one hand, she presided over a period of extraordinary industrial growth, scientific progress, and global expansion. On the other hand, her reign was also connected to inequality, colonial conflict, and social hardship. These realities exist together, and they cannot be separated. What remains clear is that her name became attached to an entire era for a reason, because her life overlapped with one of the most transformative periods in modern history, and because More than most monarchs, she became a symbol of her age. Not its creator, but its witness, its anchor, and eventually its name.